Putin is somebody who seems to be utterly immune to bad press, at least outside of Russia. So I'm wondering how HRW tackles a case like this.
Well, I mean, in the book, I describe how, while most human rights abuses are shameful in the eyes of the public of a country, there are exceptions. And the one I described, for example, is Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban. If you went up to him and said, you're mistreating migrants, he would say, of course I am. That's my political platform. That's how I won the last election.
Right.
And so while that kind of abuse is actually shameful within Hungarian cities, it's not shameful in the countryside, which is where Orban's base is. Now, ironically, he faces actually a very significant electoral threat today. So his majority is very much in jeopardy from a charismatic opponent, this guy, Peter Magyar. But at the time when we were addressing this, a frontal approach of just shaming him for his mistreatment of migrants wasn't going to get us anyplace. And so in that case, we had to say, well, what else can we use? And as I describe in the book, we focused on the European Union, on Brussels, because his mistreatment of migrants was shameful in Brussels. And Orban depended on billions of euros in subsidies from the European Union every year. And after a big fight, we were able to persuade the European Union to condition those subsidies on an end to what they call violations of the rule of law. And so that was an example where kind of an indirect shaming process coupled with this sort of economic pressure was successful. I describe another issue in the book where we were looking at in Egypt, under the Mubarak government, the Cairo police were basically soliciting on the internet, entrapping and then torturing gay men. And this was something that, because LGBT rights were so frowned upon within Egypt, a frontal approach wasn't going to be very effective. It wasn't necessarily going to lead to shame. But what was shameful within Egypt was the idea of torture. And so we presented the torture of gays in conjunction with the torture of dissidents and the torture of Islamists. And that was kind of a more palatable way to address it. But we also went to the US government, where LGBT rights were much more popular. And we're able to get a bunch of members of Congress to write a letter to Mubarak saying this got to stop. And the US was a huge supplier of military aid to Egypt. They had to listen. And the combination ended the practice. It basically ended completely. It picked up a little bit over the years, but it was essentially over with. And so we were able to pursue, kind of an indirect route of shaming that proved, successful. So these are the kinds of strategic things one has to go through. Now, in a case like Russia today, I think up until Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, he still was susceptible to shaming. I describe in the book how we were able to stop the bombing of civilians in northwestern Syria and Idlib province, basically by putting pressure on Putin, by working through, Macron, the French president, Merkel, the German chancellor, and Erdogan, the Turkish president, to get them to pressure Putin to stop because he cared about his relations with Europe. Now, obviously, since the full-scale invasion of the Ukraine, that kind of shaming isn't possible. But and in a sense, everything has been thrown at him. Not only a bunch of sanctions, but also, huge military support for Ukraine. And at this point where, his invasion is really an existential crisis for him. If he's seen as, having wasted all of these Russian lives, having, kind of courted disaster for just, his personal reasons, he could be overthrown very quickly. And in those circumstances, it's almost as if anything goes. And so the only thing one can do is to continue to ratchet up the pressure. And so, today, our strategy is really to focus on Trump and get Trump to, stop his instinctive alliance with Putin, and to recognize that Putin is the obstacle for a just peace in Ukraine, and to, live up to his vow of so-called severe consequences if Putin continues to obstruct a ceasefire there. So, you have to change the tactics. And there are people, like Putin or like Assad in Syria until his overthrow, who are so awful that they do become shameless. But that's really rare. most leaders do pretend to respect the rights of their people and can be affected through shame.